All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of D&D Deep Dive, the show where we dive deep into classes, subclasses, and other features of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons to help you get the most out of your choices. So, today, we are going to be examining the arcane world of the Sorcerer. Again, this series is focusing on homebrewing different options for the various classes and looking specifically at the defining features of those classes and how you can modify them and work with them in order to create interesting homebrew options for each one of the classes. So we're going into the Sorcerer. The Sorcerer is kind of interesting, to be honest, because the Sorcerer is, again, another class that didn't exist in the original D&D. And this is another one where I'm not quite sure if it actually existed in 2nd edition or not. I know it existed in 3rd edition. But 2nd edition I'm a little bit fuzzier on because the lines between 2nd and 3rd edition get blurred a little bit because there was a little bit of blending that happened specifically for games like the Baldur's Gate series on PC. Those were set in 2nd edition to D&D. They used the 2nd edition rules. However, there were 3rd edition rules that were changed effectively to fit into 2nd edition. And so there were certain subclasses, and I think at least one class that showed up in Baldur's Gate and had a 2nd edition rule set that didn't actually exist in 2nd edition anywhere. So that's what always confuses me because I didn't personally play 2nd edition, but I know it pretty well from the tons and tons of Giga games and other books and stuff like that came out during 2nd edition. So, anyway, so the Sorcerer was kind of created to deal with one of the issues of earlier versions of D&D Magic and how they prepared them, which was effectively in old school D&D all the way up through 3rd edition. This is how it worked. When you prepared your spells, you would prepare specific spell slots. So you would prepare, 3 casting of 1st level cure light wounds, let's say. And then when you were adventuring, that was the number of spells that you had of that. So let's say you're a wizard. And you have access to all these different spells, but you decided that for today, for your 1st level spells, you're just going to prepare 4 copies of magic missiles. And you get to fight with a troll, and trolls require either acid or fire damage to actually stop them regenerating. You can't kill them without that. Well, it doesn't matter that the wizard knows knows quite a few different fire spells. If they didn't, like Burning Hands, if they didn't prepare a slot with Burning Hands in it, they couldn't do it. The Sorcerer, when it was first introduced, would just learn spells and would have spell slots, and you could basically take any spell you knew and use a spell slot of the appropriate level to cast that spell. It's actually pretty identical to how 5th edition Magic works in general, is you have spell slots and you have prepared or known spells. And any class can just fit in their spells to the slots that they have. But that was something that was unique to sorcerers and bards when bards turned into spellcasters, because bards have a really weird, complicated history where they have been literally just about everything and eventually turned into the spellcasters that they are now. But so that's where sorcerers started. And then in 4th edition, everything got weird. And then in 5th edition, again, everybody could do. One of the kind of calling cards of this as a sorcerer was that flexible casting aspect of it, where they could just learn spells and then use spell slots, and it was a lot easier to be a little bit more fly by the seat of your pants, which lore-wise is how sorcerers go. So they had to create something a little bit different for the 5th edition version of the Sorcerer, and that's when we get into the defining features. So let's dive into this Sorcerer. Quick reminder, if you do enjoy these videos, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to turn notifications on. All those things are super important for people seeing these videos. That being said, so let's dive into the actual defining features of the Sorcerer in 5th edition. So, what are defining features? Well, quick refresher on 5th edition class design. In 5th edition, every class is designed to play very, very differently right from the beginning. In order to do that, classes have these things called defining features. A defining feature is either something that is unique to the class, or maybe it's not unique, but the class gets it earlier or can use it in a different way. And in order for something to be a defining feature, it needs to show up within the first 2 levels. So, what are the defining features of the Sorcerer? Well, the Sorcerer, in the first 2 levels, gets 3 different features. They get their spellcasting. They get Font of Magic, which is what sorcerers are known for. That's the big defining feature. Like Rage for barbarians, Font of Magic for sorcerers. And then also, Font of Magic they get at 2nd level, but also at 1st level, they choose their Sorceress Origin, which is their subclass. So, sorcerers do get to choose their subclass at level 1, which means a subclass can add defining features to the class. It makes the sorcerer very, very... It makes choosing your Sorcerer's Origin will make your sorcerer play very, very differently. Even more so than something like a fighter's subclass is going to change it. Because sorcerers get it so early, they feel very, very unique depending on their subclass. So let's dive into the actual defining features. First things first, spellcasting. Spellcasting is kind of a weird defining feature because, according to the definition I just gave, it's not really a quote-unquote defining feature. Because spellcasting is, the spellcasting that sorcerers get is identical to the spellcasting that bards get. So, if you were playing a sorcerer or a bard, you cast spells the exact same way at level 1. It doesn't work for a defining feature. A defining feature is supposed to make you play differently right from level 1. And so the aspect of spellcasting that makes it a defining feature is, first of all, how it interacts with their subclass. Your subclass in general is going to interact with your spellcasting in some way, shape, or form. Sorcerers are full spellcasters, so they get lots of spells and they'll cast them a lot. And the spell list. Sorcerers have a similar spell list to wizards. They don't have every single spell the wizard has, but they have almost all of them. Whereas bards have a very different spell list. It tends to be a little bit more limited, and it does pull from other spell lists. Like, it's got some spells in common with clerics and druids. Things like that. So the thing that makes spellcasting a defining feature for the sorcerer is its spell list and how it interacts with your sorcerer's origin. And it makes it kind of interesting. Again, for those of you that are not familiar with the terms like half-caster, full-caster, things like that, a full-caster is someone that gets spellcasting generally at level 1, and they can cast spells all the way from 1st level all the way through 9th level eventually. All full casters have the same progression of when they get their spell slots. And they get the same number of spell slots as every other full caster. So that aspect of spellcasting never changes. So that's what I mean when I say full spellcaster. It means they're going to be able to cast every spell available to their class and go all the way up to 9th level spells. Sorcerers, however, are a little bit different than things like clerics or wizards, where They learn spells. They don't prepare spells. And the difference being a cleric prepares spells every morning. When they wake up, they say a prayer to their god, and they pick the spells that they want to have prepared for that day. They have a limited number of spells that they can prepare per day, and they choose them every morning. A sorcerer learns spells every time they level up. So, instead of every morning, they may have a new list of spells that they have access to that day. No, they always know the spells that they know. And they always have them available. They never have to worry about preparing them or anything like that. They just, if you know a spell, you can cast it. They do have something kind of interesting where, because they learn spells, when they level up, they learn spells. Because that can be a little bit permanent, and if you choose the wrong spell, it might be detrimental to you. Whenever you gain a level as a sorcerer, you can choose one of the sorcerer spells you know and replace it with another spell from the sorcerer spell list, which also must be of a level for which you have spell slots. They can never learn a spell that they don't have spell slots for, but it does mean as you level up, you can technically replace lower level spells with higher level spells. Or if you just have like a first level spell, like you took Absorb Elements and it just really hasn't been something that you ever use. You can replace it maybe with a shield spell, because perhaps you're just getting hit a lot more with attack rolls, or you're counter spelling a lot, so it's just not, you're not getting hit with spells, but you are getting hit with attacks. So having something that is more useful for you in that realm might make sense. So it's one of the things, and it's literally the exact same way with the bard. They both have this kind of flexible option where as they level up, they can replace spells that they haven't used as much or just aren't fitting their build or anything like that. So that is spell casting. And again, when we actually talk about the two Sorcerer's Origins, the two subclasses that show up in the Player's Handbook, we'll be able to talk a little bit more about how spellcasting becomes a defining feature, as opposed to, as it is now, it is literally just, well, you can cast spells. And there's nothing that makes playing a sorcerer any different from playing a bard built into spellcasting in itself. And again, in 5th edition, that's a bad thing. You want, right from level 1, you want your sorcerer to feel different than a wizard or a bard or anything like that. Because in earlier editions, until you hit anywhere between level 3 to level 5, everybody played the same for the most part. If you were a weapon user, you did the exact same thing. Go up, hit them with your weapon. You really wouldn't start feeling unique until like level 3 or level 5. And 5th edition wanted to change that. So, yes, that is spellcasting. Again, the second thing that they get at level 1 is their Sorcerer's Origin. We're not going to go into that right now. We'll go into that when we actually talk about the origins themselves. But understand, they do change the class pretty epically. And so it is a defining feature, and definitely makes you play differently than a bard, because bards don't get their subclass until level 3. So yes, that is what the Sorcerer's Origin is. One of the big things that's going to make at level 1 you feel very different when you're playing a sorcerer. Finally, at second level, you also get Font of Magic. And this is the big thing for sorcerers. When people think of sorcerers in 5th edition, they think of Font of Magic. Font of Magic gives you a new limited resource called sorcery points. You have the same number of sorcery points as you have levels of sorcerer. So Font of Magic, you start with 2 sorcery points. And at level 2, the only thing you can do with Font of Magic is you can turn sorcery points into spell slots, and spell slots into sorcery points. However, as you level up, as soon as you hit level 3, so technically this isn't a quote-unquote defining feature, but it modifies a defining feature. You get a thing called meta magic. Meta magic is not unique to 5th edition. Meta magic was actually, I don't know about 2nd edition, but in 3rd edition it was a big part of it, because you had meta magic feats, which would allow you to cast certain spells at higher levels for better benefits or cast them in different ways. But in order to do that, you had to take a feat in order to be able to do that. And when you prepared your spells in the morning, you would have to prepare, like, let's say you wanted to, like, quick cast a magic missile as a spell. Well, you would have to prepare it at, I think, again, I never used magic in 3rd edition because it was really complicated for what it did. But you would have to prepare it in like a 3rd or 4th level spell slot to be able to cast it as the quicken form. And so it became remarkably complicated to use metamagic, because first you had to take the metamagic feats in order to use that style of metamagic, and each different version of metamagic had its own feat. And then when you were preparing spells in the morning, you would need to prepare like a 1st or 2nd level spell, but you'd have to prepare it in like a 5th or 6th level spell slot in order to use whichever version of meta magic you were using. And each one had a different kind of upgrade to spell slots you had to do. And again, this was how it worked back then. When you prepared it, that was that spell slot. So if you were going to use a meta magic that required a 4th level spell slot to use a 1st level spell, that meant you were replacing a 4th level spell with a 1st level spell in that same slot. So you would have less 4th level spells that you could cast. Again, that's not how it works in 5th edition, so meta magic had to change as well. And meta magic in earlier editions was limited, wasn't limited at all. Any spellcaster could take meta magic options. I think the only prereqs for taking a meta magic was you had to be able to cast a spell. So anyone that had spellcasting abilities could, as one of their feats, take a metamagic option. It would just be limited on, well, do you have high enough spell slots to be able to cast one of these spells with a metamagic option for it. 5th edition, metamagic is controlled by sorcery points. Most metamagic options cost a single sorcery point. They allow you to manipulate the spell as you cast it. And that's what most sorcerers would use their sorcery points for. Yes, the flexible casting aspect, where you can turn sorcery points into spell slots and spell slots into sorcery points, can be very, very useful. And I do know quite a few sorcerers that will people that play sorcerers, that it's very, very beneficial to be able to turn a couple lower level spell slots into a higher level spell slot, or taking like a 4th, maybe you just don't have any 4th level spells that you use a lot of, but you use 3rd level spells all the time for your counter spell. So it might be that you take a 4th level slot, turn it into sorcery points, and then use those sorcery points to create a 3rd level slot, or things like that. So yeah, the entirety of the Sorcerer is built around this idea of being able to modify things on the fly. Sorcerers are very much improvisational spellcasters, and their subclasses tend to reflect that idea. Most of the subclasses are going to give you options that allow you to change things on the fly and go a little more seat of your pants style stuff. So yeah, understanding font of magic and learning what are good things to give sorcery point uses for, and what are things that are just going to kind of break the game, is really important. And understanding that sorcerers are the only class that is not limited to a maximum of 4 casts of any level of spell. Because of flexible casting, they can cast more than 4 3rd level spells. The only limitation to flexible casting is they cannot create spell slots above 5th level. So 5th level is the highest they can. But that does mean that, given enough sorcery points, they can cast 8 1st level spells in a day. So understand, especially if one of the things you're doing in your homebrewing is you're giving them access to new spells. Understand, unlike every other class in the game, there's a chance that they will be able to cast this spell more than other classes. So just the limitations of magic are not as limiting for sorcerers as they are for other classes. So doing things like adding concentration spells can be a way to limit that, because it still means that they can only have one of those spells cast at a time, and other things like that. So that being said, the sorcerer itself, the sorcerer itself is not a remarkably complex class at first and second level, and the defining features themselves are not particularly complex. Once you get into the meta magic aspect of it, at third level, you can get a little bit more confusing, specifically with things like Twin Spell and Quicken Spell, where it allows them, Twin Spell allows them to cast a spell at 2 different targets simultaneously. There are some limitations to that. It has to be something that targets only one character. And then Quicken Spell allows you to cast a spell that normally would take an action as a bonus action. Those are the 2 things that when you are homebrewing for the Sorcerer, you need to understand that those exist. Because both of them can cause large issues with the class, especially for Quicken Spell, because if you are giving your homebrew things that you can use your action for, it's no longer a choice it's no longer a choice between, do I cast a spell or do I do this other action thing? They can quicken a spell, and that means that they can cast a fully leveled spell as their bonus action, and then also use their action to do whatever thing in their subclass allows. And because of that, action economy becomes very important. Sorcerers can't cast 2 leveled spells in the same turn, because if you cast a bonus action spell, you can only cast a cantrip as your action. That is a limiting factor that was created with the sorcerer in mind. But if you give them action-based abilities that are as powerful as spells, but aren't casting a spell, they're no longer limited by that bonus action thing. So understand, when you are homebrewing for this as a sorcerer, because of Quicken Spell, you need to be careful about the action, the abilities as you get them that they use their action for, because normally a limiting factor in that is, well, I either have to do this action or I can cast a spell. Sorcerers can do both. So let's move into the subclasses. There are 2 subclasses that show up in the player's handbook for the Sorcerer. They are the Draconic Bloodline, and they're the Wild Magic Sorcerer. Each one, this is one of the ones that I find to be most interesting, because they play really, really differently, even compared to other subclasses in other classes. Like, it's really interesting just how kind of diametrically different a Draconic Sorcerer is to a Wild Magic just a Sorcerer. And I like that. I think it's really interesting. And I think it just goes to show that Wizards of the Coast really understood the Sorcerer right from the beginning, whereas other classes like the Ranger or the Barbarian, if you watched last week's episode, they didn't quite understand them perfectly right from the beginning. Their understanding grew as the game grew. So let's start with the Draconic Bloodline. The first thing that happens with the Draconic Bloodline is you choose a type of dragon for your ancestor. And what's listed in the PHB is they have both metallic and chromatic dragons, and they are all associated with a damage type. I can't remember now. Fizban's Treasury of Dragons came out late last this year, and it added crystal or gem dragons to D&D 5th edition. They may have expanded Draconic Ancestry in that book. I can't remember. But as far as what we have in the PHB, it is the traditional chromatic and metallics. And it specifically gives you the ability to read and write in Draconic, and when you make a charisma check while interacting with dragons, your proficiency bonus is doubled if it applies to that check. So communicating with dragons when you have the Draconic Bloodline does give you stuff. And this sounds like it is a role-playing feature, because that particular aspect is role-playing, but they don't really talk about anything else that would be mechanical advantages for Dragon Ancestor. However, the very next thing that you get does get some changes. First, it's called Draconic Resilience at first level, and your hit point maximum is increased by 1. So you have 1 extra hit point per level. So by 20th level, you have 20 extra hit points. And when you aren't wearing armor, your AC equals 13 plus your Dex mod. So this is when we start seeing defining features effectively being added through a subclass. And this one in particular is 13 plus your Dex mod is better than any light armor in the game. That is effectively studded leather plus 2, because there's no limitation to the dexterity modifier. So dragon sorcerers are effectively running around with studded leather plus 2 armor right from the get-go. And sorcerers are single attribute dependent classes. They really only need their charisma modifier for everything that they do for their class. So having a good dexterity is not difficult for a sorcerer, and is actually a pretty good idea, because having a high dex means you are significantly more likely to make dex saves against spells, and in this particular instance, it means even with a 16 dexterity, which is a very possible starting level for your dex, that means your base armor class is going to be 16 at level 1, wearing no armor. It's pretty nice. Now, things like mage armor does not add to this. Mage armor would replace it, because it specifically says your armor is now this plus your dex mod. And Draconic Resilience is a little bit better than mage armor. So this is another thing that you need to think about when you are building options for a sorcerer homebrew, is what magic do they already have access to is going to be similar to this, or is going to replace this. If they have a spell that already does this but does it better, maybe you need to think about modifying it. Or in this particular case, this is better than mage armor. So that will mean that a dragon sorcerer is never going to learn mage armor, because they have something that's naturally just better than it. There's no reason for them to waste a spell slot or a learning slot, really, on learning mage armor when it's already better. So if you are giving abilities like this built into your homebrew, understand that it is going to change what spells they choose to learn. So as you go forward, at 6th level, you finally find out why choosing a specific Draconic Ancestry means something, because you get your elemental affinity. When you cast spells that deal damage of the type associated with your Draconic Ancestry, you can add your Charisma modifier to 1 damage roll of that spell, and at the same time you can spend a sorcery point to gain resistance to that damage for an hour. So this is where we start seeing spellcasting becoming a quote-unquote defining feature, because now they can do something that no other class can do. Specific spells, they get to add their Charisma modifier to damage. They do limit it to 1 damage roll of that spell. So let's say you chose a red dragon as your Draconic ancestry, and you cast Scorching Ray. Well, Scorching Ray fires 3 different bolts. Without that thing, Elemental Affinity would mean that every single one of them would get that additional damage, and it would highly incentivize. It would highly incentivize sorcerers to get things that made multiple attack rolls or multiple damage rolls. It does limit to 1 damage roll that spell, but it doesn't limit it to leveled spells. So even your cantrips are going to be good. And again, this is going to affect what spells the player chooses to learn. And if they weren't aware of this ability existing, like for a new player that hasn't planned out their character from the beginning, when they get to 6th level and they go, oh, they may decide to start replacing lower level spells with different ones that fit with their elemental affinity. So understand when you're homebrewing, doing things like this that specializes them into a specific type of spell casting will affect the spells that they choose and will affect how they play the game. So doing things like this can be a really useful tool to help kind of encourage players to play your homebrew the way you intend it to play. Give them incentives to use the kind of spells that you would want them to use, and they will naturally do that, as opposed to you doing the opposite, which is you can only cast these specific spells when doing this. That's a little bit more limiting and tends to be a little bit less fun when you compare it to something like, well, if you do this, you'll get something nicer, compared to, I'm going to make it so you can only do this. So really, really nice way to, in game design, to encourage, to get people to play the class the way you want it to as part of your subclass, without having to be, no, this is the only way to play. So that being said, 14th level, you get wings as a Draconic Sorcerer, which, again, we've talked about in other classes, giving them access to a different movement type can be really, really useful. And flying speed in general for spellcasters is dangerous, just in general, because they can turn into what's colloquially called the floating wizard turret, which is basically they get high enough off the ground that melee characters can't hit them, and then they just cast spells completely immune to anything other than ranged damage. And the interesting thing about the Dragon Wings is the fact that it isn't a concentration spell, so there's nothing limiting them, whereas like the fly spell, if they cast the fly spell, they're limited to non-concentration spells only while they're playing their turret roll. So understand if part of your subclass is going to give them a different type of movement, like giving them teleportation or giving them flying speed or swimming speed. Understand that is going to massively change how things work for them. Something that a lot of people don't think about, swimming speed, when you're talking about underwater combat, the disadvantage on all attack rolls except for like piercing weapons only counts if you are if you don't have a swimming speed. So if part of your homebrew subclass gives them a swimming speed, that means underwater they can do things like use the Shadow Blade, the Shadow Blade spell. They can use that underwater without disadvantage as long as they have a swimming speed, and that is a really, really useful spell. And if they have something that gives them decent armor, you can turn into a melee sorcerer pretty easily and do crazy amounts of damage. Yes. And then finally, at 18th level, they get a cool kind of transformation effect where you burn 5 sorcery points, and you exude an aura or awe of fear. Or no, an aura of awe or fear, so reverence or terror, to a distance of 60 feet. It does count as a concentration spell, but you can either charm or frighten any creature in the aura until it ends. And again, I've talked about both of those can be remarkably useful. I tend to think in combat, frightened is a little bit more useful than charmed, but outside of combat, charmed is more useful than frightened. And Draconic Presence is not limited to just being in combat. And this is something that you see in quite a few different subclasses for the Sorcerer in particular, is their ultimate ability a lot of times will have a transformation aspect where they spend a bunch of sorcery points and they can transform into something which gives them new abilities. Again, this is a really, really fun thing to do as part of a subclass. But you also need to understand that unless, like for Draconic Presence, they count it as a concentration spell. That is a limiting factor, meaning they can't do Draconic Presence and cast another concentration spell. So understand, if you are going to be giving a transformation aspect, remember, sorcerers are full spellcasters, and sorcerers can cast spells as bonus actions. So if you give them a transformation ability and give them things that they can use with their action, they can use their bonus action to cast 9th level spells and then use their action to do whatever it is. You are not having to choose between one or the other. Plan accordingly. All right, so that was the Dragon Sorcerer. Moving on, and dropping my cap. Really? Don't go. I'm going to lose this damn cap, darn it. Well, there goes the cap to my water bottle. I hate doing that. I hate having uncovered drinks. Anyway, moving on to Wild Magic. Wild Magic sorcerers are the bane of everybody. When a lot of DMs see a Wild Magic sorcerer, they get worried because Wild Magic is unpredictable. That's the whole point of Wild Magic. And people that tend to choose to play a Wild Magic sorcerer tend to be agents of chaos. Players can also be worried about Wild Magic sorcerers because, again, some of the things that can happen, like one of the things that can happen, if you roll a 7 or an 8 on the Wild Magic Surge table, you cast Fireball as a 3rd level spell centered on yourself. So you self-cast Fireball, and that means anyone within 20 feet of you is getting hit in the face with a Fireball. And that includes allies. So Wild Magic does have a bad rep. And I think it is a little bit unfounded, and I think most of it is because of people that play the class poorly. But Wild Magic is a great example of a way to vastly change how the sorcerer plays. So the first thing that you get when you choose Wild Magic at first level is called Wild Magic Surge. Once per turn, the DM can have you roll a d20 immediately after you cast a sorcerer spell of first level or higher. If you roll a 1, you roll in the Wild Magic Surge table to create a magical effect. So basically, every time a sorcerer casts... a Wild Magic sorcerer casts a spell of first level or higher, the DM can just have them roll in the Wild Magic to the table. Now, it does require you to roll a 1, so you only have a 5% chance anytime you cast a spell of it being a Wild Magic Surge, and this is controlled by the DM. So the DM can have them do it every single time they cast a first level spell, as long as it's once per turn. Which, again, can only happen once per turn with how magic works. So every time they cast a spell, they can have them make this roll to see if they make a Wild Magic Surge. Meaning, basically, 1 out of every 20 times you cast a spell, you're going to get a Wild Magic Surge. But it says the DM can. Doesn't say the DM has to. So, Wild Magic Surge, this aspect of it is entirely is entirely reliant on the DM actually doing it. If you're a DM running a wild magic sorcerer, I highly encourage you to have them roll this every time they cast a spell, because that's one of the things that's so interesting about the class is the wild magic option, and it makes them choose when they cast their spells more carefully, and they will position themselves in different places depending on the magic surges that they tend to get the most. So yes, use this as much as you can. I know it feels chaotic and it's supposed to, but that's part of being a wild magic sorcerer, is when you're doing things, different things are going to happen, and it makes the wild magic sorcerer even more improvisational than your standard sorcerer, even with meta magic and the things like that. I'm not going to go over the wild magic table. I did a deep dive on that, so you can watch the deep dive if you want the whole thing. The other thing they get at first level is Tides of Chaos. You can manipulate the forces of change and chaos to get advantage on one attack roll, ability check, or saving throw. And once you do so, you must finish a long rest before you can use this feature again. Any time before you regain the use of this feature, the DM can have you roll in the Wild Magic Surge table immediately after you cast a sorcerer spell of first level or higher. Then you regain the use of this feature. So, a lot of wild magic is RNG manipulation. It's statistical meddling, to be honest. And one of the ways they can do that is this Tides of Chaos allows you to just give yourself advantage on something. But once you do it, that lets the DM force you to roll in the wild magic table instead of roll a d20 and on a 1 you roll on it. This one, if you're a DM, you need to be significantly more careful about it. Just because, again, if it's something that happens every time, they're going to use Tides of Chaos all the time so that they're always casting, they're always getting wild magic rolls, and it becomes very, 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 very chaotic. And as soon as you make them roll, you're basically giving them advantage again on something that they want. So this one, you need to rate it in a little bit, but again, the more times, this is something that both the player and the DM controls. The DM can't force them to roll on the wild magic table if they haven't used Tides of Chaos. And the player can't use Tides of Chaos again until the DM makes them roll on the table. So this creates a really interesting relationship between and interactions between the DM and the sorcerer player that I think is really fun. And again, makes the class play very, very different from even a dragon sorcerer. A wild magic sorcerer is going to feel incredibly different right from level 1 just because of this Tides of Chaos thing. It's going to mean that they're going to choose their spells differently. Tides of Chaos they can use on attack rolls. So they may choose more spells that have them make attack rolls instead of have enemies make saving throws. All of these things you need to understand when you are homebrewing, but because doing something like this, giving them advantage on attack rolls, is going to change what spells they choose, what cantrips they choose when they're playing the class. So again, if you want them to play a certain way, like if I wanted to create like a spell slinger subclass where they're literally a gunslinger that uses spells instead of guns, I would probably put something in that gave them benefits to attack rolls because that feels more spell slinger. You know, shooting off scorching rays, you can go Q Q Q. That feels more spell slingery than casting a fireball or calling down a bolt of lightning or something like that. So those are different ways that you can manipulate the feel of your subclass just by incentivizing certain things like attack rolls versus saving throws. Moving on, you then get Bend Luck. When another creature you can see makes an attack roll, ability check, or saving throw, you can use your reaction and spend 2 sorcery points to roll a d4 and apply the number rolled as a bonus or a penalty to the creature's roll. You can do so after the creature rolls, but before any effect of the roll occurs. So this is another way to use sorcery points, and this specifically uses a reaction. Doesn't use a bonus action or an action, so this doesn't have to worry about spellcasting. This is something that happens when it's not their turn. It does mean you can choose to do bad luck or counterspell, which I like. I think more casting classes should have reactions to make counterspell a less necessary option at higher levels. At higher levels, anyone that can have counterspell currently probably should, because most spellcasting classes do not have a better use of their reaction than counterspell. Counterspell is that useful. That's why some people consider it broken. One of the easiest ways to balance counterspell is give classes other uses for their reaction, because you only get one reaction per round. So by giving them other useful uses of their reaction, they won't counterspell nearly as often, because that means they can't use something like bad luck. So when you're homebrewing, don't forget, reactions are a thing. Giving players reaction abilities can be fun. Tying this one to sorcery points to get it into that defining feature tie is a good way to give it even more limitations, because now not only do they need to choose to use their reaction to do this, but they also have to choose, okay, 2 sorcery points is a first level spell slot or is a single quickened spell. So that means, is having this person make their save or having this creature miss their save worth as much as me quickening a spell next turn? See, those are the choices that you want to give them, and that will that is a good way when you're trying to design different uses for sorcery points. That is a really good way to figure out balance. Is look at what they can do with that same number of sorcery points. 3 sorcery points is a second level spell slot. So if you look at second level spells, something that costs 3 sorcery points should be similarly on par to what you could do with a second level spell. Things like that. 14th level, they get Controlled Chaos. This is more RNG manipulation. Basically, anytime they roll in the Wild Magic Surge table, you can roll twice and use either number. Again, this just builds off of Tides of Chaos and Wild Magic Surge by giving them slightly more control. And that will encourage them to use Tides of Chaos more. It will encourage them to cast more spells, because now, if they get the thing where, they cast Fireball on themselves, well, now they have 2 different rolls. And so if they're in a spot where casting Fireball on themselves is going to be beneficial, then they'll do it. But if they're in a spot where they're going to hit all their allies with their own Fireball, then they'll have a different thing to do. And that can be another thing that you can do. If you if part of your subclass is going to evolve random chance, which I like. I like a little random chance. I mean, it's the reason why we use dice in D&D is random chance can be a lot of fun. So if you build that into your class, one of the things you can do at higher levels is simply add a way to control the random chance a little bit. This is effectively giving you advantage on your Wild Magic Surge rolls, despite the fact that the Wild Magic Surge is a D100 roll as opposed to a D20 roll. But just that little bit of control can feel really, really rewarding. And you see this in a lot of other subclasses that have you rolling on tables, that they'll, at higher levels, they'll just add in, okay, well, now you can roll twice and choose which one you want to use. And it's really fun, and it feels really good. So if you are homebrewing something that adds random chance, add a little bit of control at a higher level. 14th level is a good place to put that in. Finally, 18th level, you get Spell Bombardment. And this is exploding dice. I like exploding dice. If you watched my Final Fantasy XIV series, I mentioned it in a couple of the different classes that I go. I like exploding dice. What exploding dice is it's a feature. I learned about it playing Open Legend, where all dice can explode. But what that means is if you roll the maximum number on the die, you re-roll it and keep the number that you rolled previously and add the new roll to it. In Open Legend, it meant that you could roll a single d20 and get a 54 as your result. Because you rolled a nat 20, you had to keep it, you rolled again, you rolled another nat 20, and then in your third roll, you rolled a 17. The more dice you roll, the more likely it's going to be that one of them is going to explode, and that changes your that incentivizes you to do different things. Rolling 1d12 versus 2d6, technically, a lot of people prefer 1d12 because you have a significantly better chance of rolling a 9, 10, 11, or a 12, specifically a 10, 11, or a 12 on a d12 than you have rolling 2d6. It's significantly harder to get those higher numbers. You also have a much better chance of rolling a low number on a d12 than you have rolling 2d6. Rolling 2d6, you're going to hit middle numbers a lot more often. Anywhere between a 4 and an 8 are going to be the numbers that you most often roll with 2d6 versus 1d12. And that's just statistical probability. It's just how probability works. So when you start dealing with things like exploding dice, it incentivizes rolling lower dice to a point. In this one, in particular, it only works for damage, so it won't work for attack rolls, which technically is a good thing because if you roll the max number on a d20, you hit automatically. So there's no reason to increase your chance of rolling a super high number. Rolling a super high number doesn't do anything in 5th edition D&D. It does do something in Open Legend. So limiting it to damage makes sense. And then you have to choose one of those dice, roll it again, and add that roll to the damage. You can use this feature only once per turn. So this does mean that you're only going to be able to explode one die one time. And that's something I'm not as fond of. And it doesn't make as big a change in their choices. Simply because if you had a choice between 3d6 and 4d4, technically, if you could, with exploding dice, 4d4 is a better choice. Because a 66 has less of a chance of having one of them explode, and your maximum is only an 18. With 44, your maximum is a 16, so it's 2 points less, but you have a significantly better chance of exploding. You have a 1 in 4 chance on any one of the dice of exploding instead of a 1 in 6, and you have more dice that you're rolling. So statistically, you have a pretty good chance on 4d4 of every time you roll 4d4, one of them showing up as a 4 and letting you explode it. Compared to 3d6, one of them turning up as a 6 is going to be significantly less likely. Probably once every 3 or 4 rolls, you would have an explosion. So spell bombardment, it does limit it, and that's something you need to think about when you are homebrewing. Unlimited exploding dice can become really, really bad. Again, I have had people, I think the highest roll we've had in my Open Legend game, Realms of the Wild, I think the highest one we've had was in the 80s. And an impossible roll in Open Legend is 30. So that is 50 points higher than something that should be impossible. So understand, exploding dice explode. They can turn things chaotic very, very quickly. It's one of the reasons it fits with the Wild Magic Sorcerer so well. And by limiting it to only a single die that could explode once, they put a lot of limitations on it, but all those limitations makes it a little bit less useful. Now, it doesn't require any sorcery points, but if you were to homebrew this, I would almost say turn it into something that you burn sorcery points on and let you explode either multiple dice, and every time you explode a die, you have to burn a sorcery point. Or if you explode a die, that die can continue exploding until it rolls under its max, and it requires a sorcery point. That makes this much more interesting. It makes it a choice on whether or not you're going to use it, because sorcery points also mean quicken spells and spell slots and all these other things. So, yeah. So again, when you're homebrewing, if you want to do something interesting like using exploding dice, remember to put limitations, because exploding dice are intentionally chaotic. And they can break encounters if you don't put some sort of limitation, and the sorcerer already has a limited resource built into it, so use it. By attaching it to sorcery points, it's really easy to balance it, because if you start realizing, okay, they're always exploding dice and it's always good, increase the number of sorcery points it costs. It is such a simple way to balance it. So yeah. So, final thoughts. The sorcerer is interesting in the idea that the one defining feature that it gets that everyone thinks about, Font of Magic, the defining feature aspect of it doesn't show up until 3rd level for most people. Most people, when they think of Font of Magic, they only think of meta magic. And so that does mean if you are designing subclasses for the sorcerer, you need to think about more than just the 1st and 2nd level defining features. You need to keep meta magic in mind when you are creating homebrew things for it. It means that if you give your homebrew an action that is not a spell, it means that they can cast a spell with Quicken Spell and use your action. So plan accordingly. Reactions are really good things to add to any spellcasting class because it makes counterspell significantly less problematic than it is. Again, part of your subclass should involve something with spellcasting, because spellcasting on its own is not really a defining feature for the sorcerer. It shares the exact same abilities with the bard, so it can't be a defining feature. But because sorcerers get their subclass at level 1, you should have something that affects spellcasting right at level 1 to make them feel different. For the Draconic Sorcerer, that Draconic Resilience does affect their spellcasting because they have a higher armor class. They're harder to hit. It means that they're going to lose concentration less, things like that. Whereas the Wild Magic, when you cast spells, wild things happen. Both of those are really good examples of ways to make spellcasting a defining feature for the sorcerer. And it does need to be a defining feature for this as a sorcerer. The sorcerer is built around magic. Spellcasting for any full caster should be a defining feature. So, anyway, that is going to be all for me today. As always, if you enjoyed this, again, like, subscribe, turn notifications on. In the comments down below, what is your favorite Wild Magic Surge results? And if you don't know any of the Wild Magic Surge results, make up a Wild Magic Surge result and put it in the comments below. Otherwise, again, it's all for me today, and I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.